Welcome back to the podcast of the History Teachers Association of New South Wales. This episode focuses on a fascinating microhistory that Dr. Rohan Howitt from the University of Sydney has been working on as part of a Australian Historical Association Copyright Agency Early Career Research and Mentorship Scheme. Rohan's research for this project has focused on the experiences of Maori workers living in colonial New South Wales prior to 1840, and so far his research has uncovered a small but significant group of Maori workers who formed an expat community centred on the Rocks district in Sydney. The study sheds new light on the growing city's status as a diverse port town, but also with extensive transnational connections. This conversation and Rohan's research more generally should be helpful to anyone teaching early colonial Australian history, or those looking into the experiences of non-Europeans in colonial Australia, the White Australia policy, and also other themes leading up to and surrounding Australia's federation. Remember that you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and SoundCloud, and I hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. Rohan Howitt. Hi Rohan, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Jonathan, thanks for having me.
Let's start with a broad picture question about this topic you've been exploring. Can you provide some of the really broad contours of Australia around the time of 1900?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first thing is that it's actually surprisingly like Australia in 2020, to be honest, in that it was a time characterised by economic crisis, by environmental crisis, and by the outbreak of plague. So I don't want to draw too many parallels to today, but certainly the dominant experiences for Australians at the turn of the 20th century. I think the first and really dominant experience was the Federation drought. So that starting in the early 1890s, but particularly from the second half of the 1890s, at least one part of Australia was in drought at any one time. And the worst years of what became known as the Federation drought were in 1901 and 1902. And these were incredibly destructive events for Australia and had a huge economic impact. So, just to give one example of that, Australia's sheep population, which had been more than 106 million at the beginning of the decade, had fallen to 54 million by the end of that decade. So, it had a huge economic impact for Australia, and that fed into the economic crisis of the 1890s that had already come about primarily because of land speculation. So that in the 1890s, it was at the time the worst economic depression that Australians had experienced. And so that was the other kind of key aspect of the crisis. You had the outbreak of Bubonic Plague in cities like Sydney in 1900, 1901. Beyond that, federation and the movement towards federation was obviously a huge part of Australian politics in the 1900s. And so at the end of 1900 and the start of 1901, it's a moment of Australia being founded in a real sense of optimism amidst these major crises. And there was a huge sense of optimism about what Australia would look like and what Australia's destiny would be. You did have a lot of transnational connections with other countries. So there was a quite dominant idea that what the United States was in 1900 is kind of a vision of what Australia would be a century into the future. So Australia had a lot of connections with the United States, particularly progressive movements. There's a lot of travel back and forth and a lot of correspondence between socially progressive thinkers in this period. There was a lot of interest in Australia and New Zealand, in other parts of the world, particularly America, but also Britain and Europe, in some of the social legislation and social ideas that were being experimented with in Australia, particularly things like giving women the right to vote and to stand in Parliament, but also experiments with things like old age pensions and minimum wages and compulsory industrial arbitration. So I think the dominant kind of themes for Australia in 1900 are we have fairly significant environmental and economic crises, but this kind of gloom is pierced by optimism at what Australia's future looks like at this moment of federation.
Can we focus in on that concept of transnationalism a little bit then for a minute? Because I think that's an important theme of this stuff you've been writing, and also it's obviously a very popular way of thinking about many different aspects of history at the moment. Many different fields are adopting this notion of transnationalism, transnational history. Wondered if you could just maybe capture the idea. What is transnational history, and then also give a bit more detail around how historians are thinking about Australia in terms of transnationalism at this point.
Yeah, so transnational history is an idea that came out in the 1990s and is a reaction to the way that historians in the 90s thought history had traditionally been written, that was too obsessed with the idea of the nation state as kind of the natural unit of historical analysis. And so the main idea of transnational history is, instead of looking at histories purely through the lens of the nation, it looks at how can you understand that history by looking at connections with other nations and states. So I think that word connections is really crucial to understanding what this kind of historical thinking is about. And so it is different to other kinds of history on an international scale. So it's not meant to be comparative. So a comparative history might look at similar events happening in different parts of the world. And that's a useful way of thinking about the past. But it's distinct from this idea of transnational history, which is exploring the connections between them. So one of the ideas that I referred to earlier was this transnational progressive thinking. And so rather than, say, comparing what was happening in terms of women's political rights in Australia and Britain and the United States, it would look at a transnational history would look at connections between women's political activists in Australia and their counterparts in Britain. So, what are the letters that are being written back and forth? How are people in Britain using the example of Australia to make their own claims for suffrage? And how does that shape our understanding of what is going on in Australia? So, how are these activists in Australia self consciously positioning themselves as a kind of shining example of what women's suffrage can do for the nation? And so it's also different in that way from something like what we would call global or world history, which is more focused on looking at the past on a global scale. So what are phenomena that happen on a global scale? So something like migration. You can certainly look at connections between nations through the lens of migration, but if you're looking at the kind of global impact of trade or migration and things like that, that would fall more under the scope of global history. And so I guess in terms of the value of this kind of thinking, it decenters the nation from what it is that we're studying. And in doing so, it allows you to look at phenomena that kind of fall under the radar a little bit. And so in the work that I've been doing, it's useful to think about it from a transnational perspective, because it means that what we think of as kind of workers and communities in Australia look different when you're looking at it from the perspective of where are people coming from outside of Australia.
So, this research project you've been working on is very much centered around migration and people's interconnections, particularly between New Zealand and Australia. Again, I just wondered if you could paint a broad picture about the kinds of non-European groups that are living in Australia around this time, because it is a complex kind of space, isn't it, in the population of Australia in 1900?
Very much so. And so I think the first thing to note is that Australia in the 19th century was more diverse, more multi-ethnic, and in some cases you could even say more multicultural than we might usually think. And so I mean by that from the very earliest days of European colonisation, the British settlements in Australia were always outward facing maritime settlements that were deeply connected to other parts of the world, and that had natural effects on the composition of the population in these colonies. So, a kind of starting point is the fact that non-white convicts were a feature of the convict system in Australia. So Cassandra Pybus has found evidence that at least 12 of the convicts on the First Fleet were men of African descent. Most likely they were former slaves who, in North America, had fought for Britain during the American Revolution, then fled to England at the start of the war, and subsequently been charged with crimes. And there are kind of reminders of that in parts of Sydney. So Blues Point in Sydney is famously named after a black American convict called Billy Blue. Australia's first bushranger was a man of African descent called John Caesar. So, from that very early days, we have to keep in mind that the convict system was not purely kind of British and Irish convicts. And sailors were also an incredibly diverse group. And so from the 1790s, you would often find British, Irish, Scandinavian, African American, Native American, Lascar or South Asian, Filipino, Aboriginal, Polynesian sailors all working alongside each other in the same ships. And so if you went to harbours in port towns like Sydney or Hobart in the 19th century, you would hear this huge variety of languages being spoken, and you would encounter a genuinely multi-ethnic community. And I think it is also worth noting that these groups were fairly comfortable practicing elements of their own culture in public. So an historian called Ian Simpson wrote a really interesting journal article about this, about the first Muharram procession in Sydney in 1806. So this was a Shia Muslim religious procession that involved a parade down the streets of Sydney by Lascars or South Asian seamen, and it included mock battles in the streets of Sydney in 1806. And of course, it's important that Aboriginal people were still there. So Paul Irish wrote a really fantastic book about this called Hidden in Plain View, in which he challenges the myth that Aboriginal people disappeared from towns and cities like Sydney as European colonisation expanded. And he shows that the Aboriginal peoples of Sydney suffered incredible disruption, but of course they didn't leave or disappeared. They stayed and they continued to live on their lands. The syllabus itself, I think, refers specifically to Chinese, Japanese, South Sea Islanders, and Afghans in Australia before 1900. And those are all important cases as well. So I think the story of Chinese migrants in Australia is fairly well known, but I think we tend to focus on one particular part of it. So we tend to focus on the stories of discrimination that Chinese miners faced on the goldfields, but there were other parts of their experience as well. So many Chinese miners did become valued parts of rural communities, particularly in the former gold rush towns that went into decline once the gold seams were depleted. So many Chinese miners remained in these towns and they became market gardeners and storekeepers and furniture makers and hawkers. And so there's a huge amount of research into this other story of Chinese Australians, these kinds of stories of adaptation and respect. And one of my favorite stories in this kind of body of scholarship is by an historian called Amanda Rasmussen, who she tells the story of a middle-class Chinese Australian man called Edward Nee Gan, who in 1904 and 1905 twice ran for a place on Bendigo local council. So he was unsuccessful, but the ideas he was using and the way he ran his campaign do help to show the degree to which he really belonged to the community in Bendigo. There were also significant Japanese communities in Australia around 1900. And I think, again, one half of this story is familiar, but other aspects of it are less well known and less often talked about. So the well known one is pearl diving communities. And this is something that I do think comes up for this particular syllabus point in textbooks a lot. So from around the 1880s, Japanese pearl divers did begin working in the pearling industry right along the northern coast of Australia, and they were part of a really multi-ethnic industry. So in 1900, for example, there were 1,295 people employed in the pearling industry in Western Australia, and only 99 of them were Europeans. 236 were Japanese, and the remainder were Aboriginal people, Chinese, Malaysian, and Filipinos. So when the Immigration Restriction Act was passed, exemptions were deliberately built into it to allow this pearling industry to continue employing non-European workers. And by the eve of the Second World War, Japanese divers accounted for around half of this workforce in towns across northern Australia. So that's the better known side of that story. But there were also Japanese communities in cities like Sydney. So from around the 1890s, young Japanese merchants began looking for trading opportunities around the world. And so they moved to cities like Sydney to set up companies that would facilitate trade with Japan. And so even when the Immigration Restriction Act was passed, well-connected middle-class Japanese businessmen found it relatively easy to get an exemption from sitting the dictation test simply by applying through the Japanese consulate at Martin Place. And because of this, a community of middle-class Japanese expatriates developed. And by the early 1900s, one of the biggest events on the Sydney social calendar was the Emperor of Japan's birthday. And so 3 or 4 premiers of New South Wales, prime ministers, senior figures in the business community, all sorts of quite high status people in Sydney would always attend these parties in Sydney to celebrate the Emperor of Japan's birthday because of the economic significance of this community of Japanese businessmen. The story of the so-called Afghan cameleers, as is well known, a vast majority of them were not from Afghanistan. There were around 2,000 or so cameleers who came to work in inland Australia from the 1860s. And then from the 1880s or so, many of them settled permanently and established significant communities in places like Adelaide, Alice Springs, and Broken Hill. And like the pearl divers, exemptions were granted under the Immigration Restriction Act to allow cameleers to continue coming to Australia to work well into the 1930s. Most of these cameleers were Muslims, and they and their descendants built the first mosques in Australia, but a significant minority of them were Sikhs. And so Sikhs were another significant non-European group in Australia in this period. They were from India, and after they were made British subjects in the middle of the 19th century, and this allowed them to move freely within the British Empire, including Australia. And so by the 1880s, when there was anti-Chinese sentiment in some parts of Australia, there were restrictions placed on peddlers' licenses that said that you had to be a British subject to get a license to work as a peddler, selling goods door to door in rural areas. And Sikhs, as British subjects, were able to apply for those licenses. So they became a really large and staple part of rural communities by working as peddlers. Many of them sent profits back to their families in India, but others saved up and bought land and started building shops and houses, and particularly on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, it became the real centre of this community. The blackbirding of South Sea Islanders is another fairly well-known example of these non-European groups in Australia. So starting from the 1860s, blackbirding resulted in around 62,000 Pacific Islanders from 80 different islands being forced to work in Australia, mainly in the sugarcane industry, in which they made up around 85% of the labour force. Around 30% of those workers died in Australia and were buried in mass graves. And by 1901, there were around 10,000 South Sea Islanders living in Australia, most of whom were then deported under the Pacific Islanders Labourers Act in the first decade after Federation, with only around 700 being granted exemptions to remain in Australia. And of course, the other community, which is the focus of my research project, is the Maori community in Sydney in the 19th century. So I think the 3 key points I would make about this is firstly that Australia is more diverse in the 19th century than is often imagined. Secondly, that this diversity has a much longer history than we often think of, and it really does go right back to the earliest days of European colonization. And thirdly, that this diversity isn't just something that happened on the peripheries of European settlement, on the cane fields of Queensland or the pearling grounds of Northern Australia or the deserts of Central Australia. While these were certainly centres for non-European communities, non-European groups were also really prominent in the economic and social and political life of Australia's towns and cities at the turn of the 20th century as well.
So, do you think it's important to be careful about how we read and interpret something like, for example, the White Australia policy? Then, I mean, what the picture you've just painted here is quite a complex picture of both attitudes and also things like exceptions to migration experiences and so on that we tend to, I think, maybe even especially, when we think of textbooks and stuff like that, it's easy to get a fairly caricatured picture of something like the White Australia policy. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely. I think it is something that it's worth uh, looking at the text of the Immigration Restriction Act, and I think there's real potential to do some really interesting source studies in this. And obviously, textbooks don't have the room to print that. But as I think we're going to talk about a little bit later, there are digital resources available that can make this a really rich site for analysis, because the Immigration Restriction Act is riddled with exemptions. And it's one of those things where the people who are responsible for enforcing it are generally customs officials. It's something where, depending on when you arrived, where you arrived, where you were from, what connections you had, there was no one experience under the White Australia policy. So, to draw a kind of major distinction, in Sydney in the 1890s and the early 1900s, if you were a middle class Japanese businessman coming to work for one of the major Japanese companies who would create jobs for Australians and provide trading opportunities, you could apply for a certificate of exemption from the Immigration Restriction Act. And it was a kind of administrative burden in that you needed to reapply for that exemption each year. But other than that, there was no real restriction on them from settling in Australia and becoming a really substantial part of local communities. And these businessmen did become really heavily involved in local church groups, in horticultural groups, in charitable organizations, things like that. At the same time, people who didn't have that status and those connections were the full force of the White Australia policy came down on them. So if you were a Japanese sailor who jumped ship to stay in Australia after your ship left, you would be imprisoned under the Immigration Restriction Act and then deported. But then, on the other hand, in Northern Australia, it was quite straightforward for those kinds of lower status, lower class Japanese migrants to find work in the pearling industry. So you could get an exemption in Northern Australia to specifically work as a pearl diver, whereas those Japanese businessmen would find it much trickier to gain those exemptions from the Immigration Restriction Act in that same place, because the demand there was for pearl divers, not for businessmen. And so it is an incredibly complex thing, and I think it's one of these things where we can't really talk about Australia as a whole, because experiences were so diverse based on time, on geography, and on all sorts of other factors.
That's a really interesting picture of particularly Japanese migration to Australia and their engagement with different communities. One of the things that does point to attention towards, though, is a fairly common theme that comes up in some history about Australia's kind of imperial attitude and in its imperial activity in the Pacific, where a lot of historians would say that Australia is really aiming to kind of maybe contain or at least limit Japanese involvement in the Pacific, and there's this great fear of the potential threat of Japanese engagement and maybe even aggression towards Australia. How do those two things work together?
That's a really good question. So I think you're absolutely right in that fears about Japanese expansionism are a real part of Australian anxieties in this period. And it's not just Japanese expansionism. There's real fears about, at different times, French and German expansionism as well. And one other aspect of my research is looking at the idea of what was called the Australian Monroe Doctrine. So the it deliberately reflects the American Monroe Doctrine, which was this idea that the United States was a new world sphere of influence, and the entirety of the North and South America should be free from European interference, so that any aggression by European powers in that entire region, even at a time when the United States was clustered around the east coast of North America, the entirety of the Americas, any efforts at European expansion would be considered an act of aggression towards the United States. And Australians in the 19th century, and particularly from about the 1880s, began referring to this idea of an Australian Monroe Doctrine, which was this idea that Australia like the United States, was entitled to its own sphere of influence in the Pacific that was vital for its security, so that any attempt by foreign powers, whether that was Germany, France, Japan, etc., any attempt to claim and colonize islands in the Pacific south of the equator, really, would be considered an act of aggression against Australia. And so there was this kind of tension between what should Australia do to contain this threat? Is it Australia's destiny to expand first and establish its own colonies in places like Papua New Guinea and Nauru? Or should Australia be a continental state and refrain from that kind of imperialism? And this is a tension that runs right throughout Australian foreign policy in the early part of the Commonwealth. And on the eve of the First World War, well, after the First World War commenced, I should say, there were newspaper reports in The Age, for example, that were referring to the fact that the war had opened up an opportunity for Australia to achieve its destiny and expand and control the islands of the Pacific. And this became a real part of Billy Hughes's policy at the Paris Peace Conference, was ensuring that Australia was given the League of Nations mandates over Papua New Guinea and Nauru to allow it to have this kind of buffer zone to protect against Japanese expansionism. In terms of how that relates to these exemptions, I think it was a very uneasy relationship. And you can really see that in the treatment of the Japanese community, in that members of the Japanese community of businessmen in Sydney were naturalized. So they became British subjects. Many of them married Australian women and had families in Australia and intended to settle here permanently, but then found themselves interned by the Australian government during the Second World War. So even though they had gained British subjecthood, they were still considered enemy aliens. And so I think it is just a really uneven tension between the desire to access these economic benefits of trade, of having expert pearl divers who can kind of open up this industry for Australians, and the anxieties about a wider foreign policy ramification. And I think the fact that these were relatively small numbers, they were always minorities, is a big part of it. And that the Immigration Restriction Act, because it was applied in this uneven way, it was a system of exemptions rather than kind of having large holes through which holes in the policy that people could exploit. It gave Australian policymakers a bit of a sense of control, and that they could control who came to Australia and the size of the communities they formed.
The focus of the essay that you are currently writing and finishing off is very much the Maori community in Sydney, particularly, which is quite a, from what I can understand from reading that, it's quite a different community, it seems, than the, say, Japanese community in some important ways. Let's just start by thinking, like, how big is this Maori community in Sydney at the time?
So this is an incredibly tricky question to answer, primarily because of problems and limitations associated with sources. So migration records for New South Wales, for example, were only systematically kept from around the 1860s, and even then there are gaps. So to get a rough idea of the size of this community, you need to look particularly at newspaper reports, and particularly at what are called claims and demands. So the notifications of when people arrive and depart from the colony of New South Wales, as well as things like letters and journals and paintings. So my research focused on the period from 1793 to 1840 and found evidence of at least 666 Maori who spent time in New South Wales, though that is quite a conservative count, and the real number was almost certainly significantly higher than that. Though, of course, all of these people were not in Sydney at the same time, and that number does include people who came here to visit quite briefly, often as kind of quasi-diplomatic visitors to negotiate with governors and businessmen in New South Wales. So at any one time, it was probably under 200 by the 1830s, but it is impossible to say for certain. And it is also worth noting that this community didn't disappear in 1840. That's where my research cuts off, because I was primarily interested in this phenomenon of the mobility of Maori across the borders of the British Empire. So in 1840, Britain annexed New Zealand. So it changes the relationship somewhat. And also the fact that the number of newspapers which I was relying on as sources really proliferated in the 1830s. So cutting off in 1840 kept the project feasible and manageable. But the community definitely continued to exist after this period, and it was still an important part of Sydney and New South Wales more generally at the turn of the 20th century. So Maori were still working in maritime industries in the early 1900s. They were a key part of rugby league teams in Sydney in the early 1900s, and they travelled to Australia regularly from New Zealand to work as shearers. And indeed, that caused a diplomatic incident in 1905 when the government tried to block a group of Maori shearers from entering Australia to work for a season as shearers by requiring them to sit a dictation test. And Australia was rebuked by the New Zealand government for this. And Prime Minister George Reid ended up issuing instructions that the Immigration Restriction Act did not apply to Maori from 1905 onwards. So it's incredibly hard to put numbers on the size of this community in the period that we're talking about because the sources don't really allow for that kind of confident analysis. But I think what we can say is that there was a substantial community there, and we can get a reasonably detailed insight into their lives in New South Wales.
So how are they living? I mean, are they sort of living in specific areas of Sydney? You mentioned they're sort of mainly working in the shipping industry and other industries like that. But what are the sort of main features of their life in Sydney?
So, one of my favourite stories from this project was the account of Louisa Ann Meredith when she arrived in New South Wales in 1839. So, she and her husband were migrating to New South Wales, and Louisa's first encounter with Australian colonists was with the pilot boat crew that met her ship to guide it into Sydney Harbour. So, there was a pilot boat crew that was made up of 6 Maori men who lived together in a tent at Watson's Bay, and they worked as a pilot throughout the late 1830s and early 1840s and would sail out to guide ships into Sydney Harbour. So, for many people migrating to New South Wales in this period, their first encounter with an Australian colonist was with Maori. Um, that was one example, but other Maori found work on farms in different parts of New South Wales. So there are records of small groups of Maori men working on farms in the Hunter Valley, in the Blue Mountains, and in Shoalhaven. But the vast majority of these Maori workers were living and working in Sydney itself. And the absolute centre of this community was the Rocks. So the first Maori, as you mentioned, in Australia were sailors and maritime workers, and they therefore tended to congregate in the district of Sydney that catered to sailors and maritime workers. So the Rocks was where the maritime community was based, and being part of this community was how sailors found work on new ships, how they found lodgings, and where they spent their leisure time. So, to give an example of this, one of the first cases I found that really piqued my interest in this topic was a report about a boat that was found floating in Sydney Harbour containing 2 bodies. And the 2 bodies were sailors from a whaling ship called the Atlantic. And one of them was European and the other man was Maori. And a coroner's inquest was called, and it found that the 2 men had been struck by lightning while returning from a spell of leave in the pubs in the Rocks that catered specifically to sailors. So it was natural, I think, that these Maori sailors spent so much time when they were in Sydney in the Rocks that when they wanted to spend longer periods of time in Sydney between voyages, they would find lodgings together in the Rocks. And then, starting in around the 1820s, Maori became increasingly prominent in non-maritime industries in Sydney. So while they were still working as sailors and whalers and as ferrymen and things like that, they were also now working as servants and apprentices. There was a case of a bricklayer. They were working as labourers in warehouses, as shopkeepers in Sydney shops, as mill workers in particular, as peddlers selling things on the street. And there was one case of a Maori woman known as Peaky, who was working behind the bar at the Warwick Arms on York Street. And while Maori were working in a wide variety of industries by the 1820s and the 1830s, they still lived primarily in the Rocks, where Maori seamen had already been living for a couple of decades. So the existence of Maori within that maritime community of the rocks helped to make this the centre of the later non-maritime expatriate Maori community. And in many ways, this community was kind of bicultural. So it continued to practice many traditional customs and practices, such as funerary practices. So there was one notable case where a European colonist observed a funeral of a Maori mill worker at Surrey Hills and criticised it in a letter to the newspapers as inappropriate because of the laughter and levity that was going on and loud singing at this funeral, which was kind of customary within Maori funerary practices, was offensive to this particular colonist's sensibilities. But they also adapted European practices. So the funeral service of the mill worker involved reading from the Bible, for example. Maori adapted European clothes and mixed with colonial society in fairly uncontroversial ways. So there was one case of a Maori man being lauded as a hero for his quick action when he plucked a child that fell off a dock at Cockle Bay and he pulled them out of the water. Another man was overheard rebuking a shopkeeper in Sydney for his ungentlemanly conduct. So this isn't to say that relations were always peaceful and positive. I did find at least 12 reported cases of violence or theft or intimidation against Maori in Sydney between 1821 and 1840. Some Maori were robbed or beaten by convicts. One group of 8 or 9 Maori was harassed by a group of soldiers. A Maori man had his clothes stolen by a sailor. Another group that just arrived off the ship from New Zealand were pelted with orange peels and stones when they disembarked in Sydney in 1829. A group of Maori sailors who were living in a house on Gloucester Street in the Rocks had their windows smashed by a free settler in 1838. So there was tension, there was violence as well, but for the most part, it did exist as a kind of bicultural community centered on the rocks.
Obviously, the one of the main things that is drawing Maori migrants to Sydney at this point is a kind of an economic factor of work and industry. Is there more to it than that, though, as well?
I think there is. It is one of those things that it's impossible to say for certain because we do know so little about these people. So in most cases, we don't know their real names. We know them by the pseudonyms that Europeans in Australia gave them. We don't generally know their kind of status and their stories in New Zealand, and we don't know their genealogies and their families. So for the most part, we can't say why individuals chose to came to Australia, but we can definitely get some idea. And there's one particularly illuminating example, which was a Maori man who worked on Alexander Berry's farm at Shoalhaven between 1835 and roughly 1838. And Berry gave details about this man's employment to a Legislative Council inquiry into the state of the labour force in New South Wales in this period in 1837. So we actually have quite a lot of information about this individual. So we know that he worked for wages of 4 shillings a week plus lodgings and rations, which was quite a low, unskilled wage that would be the equivalent of around £12 today. We know that his main expense was clothes because these were not included in his rations, so he had to buy his own clothes. But after working for Berry for 2 years, he had managed to save up a little over £5. And at the time of the inquiry, the man was intending to work for Berry for another year, and then he intended to use his savings to purchase agricultural tools and seeds and livestock to take back with him to New Zealand. So this does suggest that for some of these Maori workers, living and working in Australia provided a way to gain status and improve their position within their community when they returned, bringing practically useful goods that would benefit their community. And in other cases, it seems more like working in Australia or on ships that were based in Australia provided opportunities for autonomy, for kind of advancement, and I think we can also say for adventure. So on whaling and trading ships, promotion was based on skill and experience and performance. So Maori who joined these ships were not necessarily held back on the basis of race or status or family. So, for example, we can trace the career of one Maori sailor known as Jackie Maitai, through reports of his comings and goings from Sydney. So when he first turns up in the historical record in 1813, he was a crewman, an ordinary seaman, on a ship that sailed between India, Sydney, and Hobart. By 1818, we know that he had shifted to working on whaling ships. And eventually he appears in Sydney in 1833 when he's working as a boat steerer, which was the most experienced and most respected and one of the best paid crew members on a whaling ship, because it was the person who was responsible for rowing out to the whale and throwing the first harpoon. And other Maori seamen were recorded as the chief officers of ships. So there were definitely opportunities to become well-paid, respected, professional seamen uh, through travelling to New South Wales. It's hard to know whether the Maori who were working as the pilot boat crews and the mill workers or the warehouses, whether they were planning to earn money to buy goods to take back to New Zealand as well, or if they intended to stay in Sydney. But regardless of what their intentions were, we do know that some members of the expatriate Maori community did spend the rest of their lives in Sydney. And there are at least 5 cases recorded in colonial newspapers of Maori being buried by their friends in New South Wales.
So there is quite a variety of experience and stories that you can recover from these sources. How do you assess the overall contribution of this community to Australia?
So I think there's a few points I can make with that. And one is less directly relevant to Australian history, but I think it is quite important when we're thinking in this kind of wider imperial frame, is that Maori were a commonplace presence in New South Wales in the first half of the 19th century, and that really changed how people in Australia thought about New Zealand. So that in the early 19th century, there were still kind of these great anxieties about New Zealand as this terrifying place, filled with cannibalism and this really intimidating place, not suitable for colonization. But I think that by having such close contact with Maori, when they're working alongside you in the mills and they're sailing ships and they're the pilot boat workers and you're meeting them in shops. I think that does lead to a change in how New Zealand is talked about in the Australian press and how kind of the colonists are starting to think about New Zealand more as a place for investment, for entrepreneurialism, and eventually for colonization. So I think it does have an impact in that way, and that's quite a speculative point, but it is worth thinking about. And then from an Australian perspective, I think the way we tell the story of kind of work in Australia tends to jump from convicts to free workers, free migrants, free labourers, and the kind of growth of an Australian working class. But that's quite a simplistic narrative. And I think that if we can look at these kinds of specific micro-historical examples, they reveal a much more complicated patchwork sort of history where you can see the contributions of multiple groups in multiple ways, which add up to a far more nuanced vision of Australian history.
This is a dangerously big question to finish off, but if a teacher wants to pick this up, this Maori community, and look at it as part of the exploration of pre-Federation Australia and so on, are there good sources that are sort of easy to access for them to do so?
I fear that this is a dangerously big answer as well, but absolutely. So there are loads of different kinds of sources that would be useful for teaching this. There's, as well as my own research, there's a lot of different books and journal articles that would be useful for any teachers that want to read further into it. And I'm happy in some way or another to give a sort of recommended bibliography. But the one that I will mention specifically now is a book called Indigenous Mobilities Across and Beyond the Antipodes that's edited by Rachel Stanfield. And the reason I want to mention it specifically is because it's published by ANU Press, which is the first open access scholarly publisher in Australia. So ANU Press publish peer-reviewed scholarly books like this one and make them available for free online as PDFs. So that book is useful for this particular topic, but it's also worth checking out ANU Press to be able to access these kinds of books on all sorts of other topics for free. And also, I think worth making students aware of this resource when they're doing things like their historical investigations for modern history in Year 11. But there are also a lot of digitized primary sources that I think would be really useful for teaching this topic, both for investigating the content and for meeting those more skills-based outcomes. So the big one is Trove, which is probably the best known resource for digital primary sources in Australian history. It collates resources from libraries and archives around the country, and it allows you to search for different categories of things like books, pamphlets, letters, manuscripts, images, etc. But what it is best known for is its collection of digitized Australian newspapers. And these newspapers were the absolute cornerstone of my own research project into Maori travellers and workers in New South Wales. So I basically just read through every Sydney newspaper published in the period I was studying, which thankfully wasn't as many as you would expect because there was only a handful of newspapers in that period. And then I just made notes about every mention of Maori in the colony, and I turned those notes into a database and then eventually into an essay. But that kind of approach obviously isn't going to work in a secondary setting. But I think that newspapers are a perfect way to develop students' skills with primary sources. You know, for one thing, they're printed, so you don't have to deal with the issue of terrible handwriting. For another one, Trove uses optical character recognition, so it means you can do keyword searches for the content of newspaper articles, and you can also download those newspaper articles as PDFs, which is particularly useful for anyone who wants to collate newspaper articles for their students to read. So Trove can be really useful for finding content specifically related to this topic because those papers include, reports on the arrivals and departures of people on ships, reports on court cases, coroner's reports, letters to the editor, as well as just general stories of interest. So it is a great way to find the sort of fine-grained historical detail that can really enrich your understanding of a topic like this. But it can also be really useful for the unit outcomes as well as the content. So I'm thinking particularly of the HT59 outcome about using relevant historical terms and concepts. And this is because search terms are so important when using Trove. So, for example, if you did a search for Maori in newspapers between, say, 1800 and 1820, you won't find much because the colonists in Australia did not use the term Maori at the time. They referred to Maori as New Zealanders. So if you search for New Zealanders, you'll get 300 results instead. You will still find some results for Maori because people have kind of manually tagged some of those articles to aid with searching. But if you do want to find all of the relevant material, you have to use search terms that reflect the language of the time. So I know a similar one that takes some getting used to is the use of the term native in Australia in the second half of the 19th century. So to understand a newspaper article that talks about the Australian Natives Association supporting federation, for example, you have to understand that native was used to refer to people of European descent who were born in Australia. And then if you were looking at, say, blackbirding and Pacific Islander labourers in Australia, you would need to know that Kanaka, South Sea Islander, and Pacific Islander were terms that were all used interchangeably. So I do think Trove is a great way to get students thinking about these terms and the language they use when studying history and why these terms matter. And it's a chance to address that HT59 outcome quite explicitly.
Rowan, thank you so much for spending time talking to us about this project. It's really fascinating, and now all I can think of is not doing the work that I need to do, but actually using these resources to go and find some other things that I'm interested in. But I really appreciate the contribution you've made here, and I wish you all the best for the research that you're continuing to do.
Yes, thanks for having me, and it was great talking to you about it.